April 23, 1944. Liège, Belgium. The rail yard sits dark under a moonless sky, silent except for the rhythmic clanking of cooling metal and the distant rumble of German supply trains moving east toward the front. Jacques Moreau crouches beneath freight car number 4738, grease coating his hands, a wrench gripped so tightly his knuckles have gone white. Above him, 40 tons of German armor sits motionless. A Panzer IV tank chained to the flatbed, one of 12 tanks on this train, destined for the 12th SS Panzer Division, fighting desperately to hold the line in France. Jacques is not a saboteur. He's not a resistance fighter. He's a Belgian railway porter, 53 years old, who spent 30 years maintaining freight cars for the Société Nationale des Chemins de Fer Belge before the Germans came. His job under occupation is simple. Inspect the brake systems on German military trains. Ensure the wheel mechanisms function properly. Make certain that tons of Nazi war material move smoothly toward the front lines. Tonight, Jacques is going to do his job incorrectly, deliberately, catastrophically. He reaches up to the brake cylinder, that critical component that controls the friction shoes pressed against the wheel. Standard inspection procedure requires checking brake pressure, ensuring the shoes engage properly, verifying the release mechanism functions. Jacques is doing something else entirely. He's swapping components between the primary and secondary brake lines, creating a modification so subtle that visual inspection won't reveal it, but so devastating that when the engineer applies the brakes, certain cars won't slow at all. This is not his first time. Over the past 6 weeks, Jacques has modified brake systems on 17 German military trains. 15 arrived at their destinations without incident. Trains moving too slowly through flat country, where brake failure meant nothing more than a rough stop. 2 trains derailed in minor accidents, blamed on track conditions and poor maintenance. Tonight is different. This train, designated Transport 451, is scheduled to depart at 0400 hours, traveling southeast through the Ardennes, crossing the Meuse River at Dinant, via the Pont de l'Enfer, the Hell's Bridge, a narrow span built in 1911, designed for passenger trains, not military freight. The route includes a sustained downgrade of 4%, steep by railway standards, where a fully loaded train will accelerate to dangerous speeds without constant braking. Jacques finishes the modification in 7 minutes. He moves to the next car, then the next. By 0330 hours, he's modified the brake systems on 8 of the train's 24 freight cars. Not enough to cause immediate catastrophic failure, but enough to create progressive brake loss on a long descent. The mathematics are elegant in their brutality. A standard freight train descending a 4% grade builds momentum exponentially. With full braking capacity, the engineer can maintain 25 miles per hour, safe for curves and bridges. With 33% brake loss, the 8 cars Jacques has sabotaged, speed will climb to 40 miles per hour, then 50, then faster. The Hell's Bridge has a posted speed limit of 15 miles per hour. At 50 miles per hour, basic physics says the train will not make the curve approaching the bridge. Jacques climbs out from under the final car, wipes his hands on a rag, and walks toward the yard office to file his inspection report. His hands don't shake. His expression reveals nothing. He's done this 73 times over 6 weeks. modifying brake systems on car after car, perfecting a technique that leaves no evidence, no trace that anything is wrong until the moment everything goes catastrophically right. What Jacques doesn't know, what he can't possibly know, as he signs the inspection log and walks away into the darkness, is that tonight's train carries more than 12 Panzer IV tanks. Hidden among the freight manifest, buried in paperwork listing routine ammunition and supplies, are 14 tons of specialized shaped charge ammunition, newly developed Panzer Granite 39/43 rounds, designed to penetrate the frontal armor of Soviet T-34 tanks. The ammunition is unstable, sensitive to impact, explicitly prohibited from air transport due to detonation risk. When Transport 4451 derails, when those freight cars leave the rails at 53 miles per hour and plunge into the Meuse River, those 14 tons of shaped charge ammunition are going to detonate with the force of a tactical nuclear weapon, destroying the bridge, the train, and every piece of German armor aboard. Jacques Moreau is a railway porter with a wrench and 30 years of experience. Tonight, he's about to change the entire timeline of the Battle of France, and he's going to do it by making brake systems work exactly wrong. The clock reads 0347 hours. Transport 4451 departs in 13 minutes. Jacques heads home to his apartment, where his wife will ask if work went well, and he'll say yes, just routine inspections, nothing special. Sometimes the most devastating acts of war aren't committed with guns or bombs. Sometimes they're committed with wrenches and knowledge, by men who know exactly which bolt to turn, which component to swap, which system to make, fail at precisely the wrong moment. The question isn't whether Jacques' modification will cause a derailment. The question is how many German tanks will be at the bottom of the Meuse River when the sun rises, and how many Allied lives will be saved because a Belgian railway porter knew more about brake systems than the Germans ever suspected. Understanding Jacques Moreau's sabotage requires understanding railway brake systems, specifically the Westinghouse automatic air brake, the standard technology on European freight trains since 1890. The system is elegant, reliable, and critically dependent on every component functioning exactly as designed. A standard freight train brake system operates on a counterintuitive principle. The brakes are applied by releasing air pressure, not by adding it. Each freight car carries a reservoir of compressed air maintained at 90 pounds per square inch. A continuous pipe, the brake line, runs the length of the train, maintaining constant pressure. When the engineer wants to stop, he reduces pressure in the brake line. This pressure drop triggers a valve in each car's brake cylinder, which then uses the reservoir air to push the brake shoes against the wheels. It's a fail-safe system. If the brake line ruptures, pressure drops instantly, and every car's brakes engage automatically. Trains can't run away with broken brake lines. The system prevents disasters, unless someone modifies it. Jacques' modification is brilliantly simple. Each brake cylinder has two critical components: the primary piston that applies the brakes and the release valve that retracts them. By swapping internal components between these two mechanisms, Jacques creates a brake system that appears to function normally during testing, but fails progressively under sustained use. During the initial brake test, when the engineer reduces line pressure, The modified cylinders engage. The brakes apply. Everything seems fine. But during prolonged braking, the kind required on a sustained downgrade, the modified release valves begin to fail. Air pressure that should release the brakes instead bleeds slowly into the reservoir. The brake shoes remain partially engaged, creating friction, generating heat, warping the metal components until the entire brake mechanism seizes in the released position. When the engineer needs maximum braking, 1/3 of his train has no brakes at all. The Germans never catch it because the modification is invisible. Visual inspection shows properly connected brake lines, correctly installed cylinders, standard components in standard configurations. Only a complete disassembly of the brake cylinder, something never done during routine maintenance, would reveal the swapped internal parts. Jacques perfected this technique over 8 months of careful experimentation, starting in August 1943, when German military traffic through Liège increased dramatically. The occupation authorities needed Belgian railway workers to maintain the trains. The Germans had their own engineers, but not enough to inspect every freight car on every train. They relied on local expertise, on men like Jacques, who'd spent decades keeping Belgian railways running. The Germans made a fatal assumption. They assumed loyalty could be enforced through threats and surveillance. They assumed railway workers facing execution for sabotage wouldn't risk their lives for minor disruptions. They were right about most workers. They were catastrophically wrong about Jacques Moreau. Jacques' motivation wasn't political. He wasn't a communist or a resistance fighter. He was a man who watched German soldiers execute his son-in-law in October 1943 for the crime of possessing a hidden radio. They shot him in the rail yard, in front of Jacques, as an example to other workers. The Germans wanted Jacques to understand that cooperation was survival. Instead, Jacques understood that he had 30 years of expertise in a system the Germans couldn't function without, and that expertise could be weaponized. His first attempts were crude. He loosened brake connections slightly, hoping for air leaks that might cause minor problems. The Germans caught 2 attempts, blamed them on carelessness, assigned him to different trains. Jacques learned. He stopped leaving evidence. He stopped creating obvious failures. He started creating delayed failures, modifications that wouldn't manifest until hours after he'd filed his inspection report and gone home. By March 1944, he'd refined the technique to the point where he could predict almost exactly when and where a modified train would experience problems. Transport 4451 is his masterpiece. He studied the route, calculated the grades, identified the Hell's Bridge as the optimal failure point. The bridge is a bottleneck, a critical crossing that the Germans can't easily replace. Destroy it, and German supply routes through southern Belgium are cut for weeks. But Jacques' plan goes beyond simple bridge destruction. The timing matters. April 1944 is a critical moment in the war. Allied forces are preparing for D-Day, the invasion of France. German armor reserves are being shifted frantically between fronts, trying to reinforce defenses along the Atlantic Wall while maintaining pressure against Soviet forces in the east. Every Panzer division matters. Every tank counts. The 12th SS Panzer Division, Hitler Youth Division, is one of the most fanatical and effective German armored formations. They're being held in reserve near Paris, ready to counterattack whatever invasion comes. Transport 4451 carries replacement tanks and ammunition to bring the division to full strength. If those tanks don't arrive, if they're at the bottom of the Meuse River when D-Day comes, the 12th SS Panzer Division will be under strength, less capable of responding to the invasion. Jacques doesn't know about D-Day. The date is the most closely guarded secret in military history, but he knows that fewer German tanks means more Allied soldiers survive. 0357 hours. Transport 4451's locomotive. A massive Deutsche Reichsbahn. Class 52. Kriegs locomotive. War locomotive. Built specifically for military freight. Begins building steam pressure. The engineer, Hauptmann Friedrich Weber, reviews his route documentation. Liège to Trier, Germany, 180 kilometers. Estimated travel time, 7 hours. Weber is a veteran railwayman, conscripted from the German National Railway to military service. He's moved trains across occupied Europe for 3 years. He knows the routes, the grades, the bridges. He's familiar with the Hell's Bridge, has crossed it 23 times. He knows to brake early, to maintain speed below 15 miles per hour through the curve. Weber's fireman, Obergefreiter Hans Schmidt, checks the brake pressure gauge, 90 pounds per square inch throughout the train. Perfect. The brake test begins. Weber reduces line pressure. Throughout the train, brake shoes engage. Wheels lock momentarily, then release as Weber restores pressure. In Freight Car 17, the car carrying 3 Panzer IV tanks and 6 tons of shaped charge ammunition, Jacques' modified brake cylinder engages normally. The release valve functions. Everything appears correct. Weber signs the departure log. Transport 4451 is cleared for movement. At 04:02 hours, 3 minutes ahead of schedule, the locomotive's whistle sounds twice. Steam pressure hits maximum. Weber releases the brakes and opens the throttle. Transport 4451, 1,840 tons of German armor and ammunition, begins rolling east toward the Ardennes, toward the Hell's Bridge, toward an appointment with Jacques Moreau's modified brake systems. Jacques is 3 kilometers away, lying in bed, listening to his wife's breathing. He can't sleep. He never sleeps on nights like this. He stares at the ceiling and calculates. Distance to the Hell's Bridge, 97 kilometers. Average speed, 40 kilometers per hour, accounting for grades and curves. 2 hours and 25 minutes until the train reaches the descent toward Dinant. If his modifications work as planned, if the brake failure develops progressively as intended, the train will be traveling at unsafe speed when it enters the curve. The engineer will attempt to brake. 1/3 of the train won't respond. Physics will do the rest. If his modifications fail, if the Germans discover the sabotage, if someone notices the swapped brake components, Jacques will be arrested by dawn, tortured for information about resistance networks he doesn't belong to, and executed. He's made his peace with that possibility. The day they shot his son-in-law, Jacques stopped caring about his own survival. He cares about the mathematics now. Tons of German armor at the bottom of the river. Tons of ammunition that won't reach the front. Days or weeks of disruption to German supply lines. One man with a wrench, multiplied by months of careful sabotage, equals a strategic impact no single resistance cell could achieve. Jacques finally falls asleep at 0520 hours. He doesn't dream. The Ardennes region of Belgium is beautiful in late April. Rolling hills covered in dense forest, rivers cutting through limestone valleys, medieval villages built around stone churches. It's terrain that favored defenders in the First World War, where trench lines stretched for miles, where millions died in mud and wire. In April 1944, it's a logistics corridor. German supply trains move through the Ardennes constantly, following routes established by Roman engineers 2,000 years ago. The Meuse River is the critical obstacle. Cross it at Dinant, and you have direct routes to Luxembourg, to Germany, to the industrial heart of the Reich. The Hell's Bridge earned its name in 1917, when a troop train derailed on the span, killing 93 French soldiers. The bridge was rebuilt in 1920, reinforced, supposedly made safer. But the fundamental geometry remained dangerous. A narrow curve immediately before the bridge, requiring trains to slow dramatically. A 4% downgrade for 3 kilometers leading to that curve, meaning trains arrive with significant momentum. Transport 4,451 rolls through the Ardennes at 42 kilometers per hour, slightly above the planned speed, but within acceptable limits. Weber, the engineer, has noticed nothing unusual. The train handles normally, braking response feels standard. At kilometer marker 47, the descent toward Dinant begins. Weber checks his route notes. 3 kilometers of sustained downgrade, maximum safe speed 25 kilometers per hour. He begins applying the brakes, reducing line pressure gradually, allowing the train to settle into controlled descent. The locomotive's brakes engage perfectly. The first 8 freight cars, unmodified, brake normally. Cars 9 through 16, modified by Jacques, initially respond correctly. The brake shoes engage, wheels slow, but the internal components Jacques swapped begin to heat up. The release valves, never designed to handle the pressure loads of primary pistons, start to deform. Microscopic metal stress fractures propagate through components not engineered for this application. By kilometer marker 48, 2 of Jacques' modified cars have lost 15% of their braking capacity. The brake shoes aren't releasing fully, creating friction, but they're also not engaging fully, reducing stopping power. Weber notices the speed climbing slightly. The train should be holding steady at 25 kilometers per hour. The speedometer shows 28. He increases brake pressure, reducing line pressure further. 3 more of Jacques' modified cars experience progressive brake failure. The release valves, now significantly deformed by heat and stress, begin bleeding air in the wrong direction. Instead of building reservoir pressure for the next brake application, air escapes uselessly into the atmosphere. Kilometer marker 49. Speed climbs to 32 kilometers per hour. Weber's fireman, Schmidt, notices the speedometer. We're accelerating. Brakes aren't holding. Weber applies maximum braking, reducing line pressure to minimum. This should engage every brake on the train at maximum force. 18 of the train's 24 cars respond correctly. Their wheels lock momentarily, then settle into controlled braking. 6 cars, Jacques modified cars, have no braking capacity at all. The release valves have failed completely. Air pressure that should engage the brakes is venting directly into the reservoir, building pressure uselessly, while the brake shoes remain fully retracted. Physics takes over. 1,840 tons, moving at 32 kilometers per hour, on a 4% downgrade. 18 cars braking, 6 cars contributing nothing but momentum. Kilometer marker 50. Speed reaches 37 kilometers per hour. The Hell's Bridge is 2 kilometers ahead. Weber knows instantly that something is catastrophically wrong. He's been a railway engineer for 24 years. He knows exactly what brake failure feels like. The train is accelerating beyond his control. "Emergency brake!" Weber shouts. He twists the emergency valve, dumping all line pressure instantly. This should trigger every brake cylinder on the train simultaneously, creating maximum possible braking force. On 18 cars, it works. Wheels lock, brake shoes scream against wheel surfaces. Metal heats to red-hot temperatures. On 6 cars, nothing happens. The modified brake cylinders, their internal components now completely destroyed by heat and stress, are mechanically incapable of engaging. The brake shoes remain retracted. Wheels spin freely. Speed climbs to 43 kilometers per hour. Schmidt stares at the speedometer, then at Weber. The bridge. "We can't make the curve at this speed." Weber knows. The Hell's Bridge curve requires 15 kilometers per hour maximum. At 43 kilometers per hour, the laws of physics say the train will derail. Center of gravity too high, momentum too great, rail can't angle. Insufficient. He has one option. Try to uncouple the cars. Separate the locomotive from the freight. Save the engine and crew at the expense of everything behind them. Weber reaches for the emergency uncoupling lever. Standard procedure. If you're going to wreck the freight cars, not the locomotive. But Transport 4451 is carrying tanks. 40-ton tanks chained to flatbed cars. The uncoupling mechanism was reinforced specifically to handle the load. What normally takes 3 seconds to release takes 30 seconds, requires sustained pressure on the lever. Weber pulls the lever, begins the 30-second count. Kilometer marker 51. Speed 49 kilometers per hour. 1 kilometer to the bridge. Schmidt braces himself against the bulkhead. "We're not going to make it." Weber keeps pulling the lever. 20 seconds, 25. Kilometer marker 51.5. Speed 52 kilometers per hour. 500 meters to the curve. 30 seconds. The uncoupling mechanism releases. The locomotive separates from freight car number 1. But momentum doesn't care about uncoupling. The locomotive is moving at 52 kilometers per hour. The freight cars are moving at 52 kilometers per hour. Separation doesn't change velocity, only means the cars are no longer pulling each other. Weber applies full locomotive braking, every brake on the engine at maximum. The locomotive begins to slow, dropping from 52 to 48 to 43 kilometers per hour. Behind the locomotive, 24 freight cars carrying 12 Panzer IV tanks, 14 tons of shaped charge ammunition, and supplies for an SS Panzer division enter the Hell's Bridge curve at 52 kilometers per hour, 3.5 times the safe speed. The first car, a flatbed carrying a 40-ton Panzer IV, experiences lateral forces exceeding the rail's holding capacity. The outside wheels lift off the rail. For one frozen moment, the car balances on the inside wheels alone, tons of steel suspended at an impossible angle. Then physics completes its calculation. The car tips, rolling left, pulling the chained tank with it. 40 tons of armor slides sideways off the flatbed, crashes into the bridge railing, a structure designed for passenger trains, not armored vehicles. The railing disintegrates. The Panzer IV plunges through, falling 40 meters into the Meuse River. Car 2, 3, and 4 derail simultaneously. The steel couplings between cars, stressed beyond design limits, shatter. The cars separate, each following its own trajectory off the rails. Car 5 is carrying shaped charge ammunition. As it derails, the car tips 45 degrees, slamming into the bridge surface. 6 tons of unstable explosive ordnance, packed in wooden crates, impacts concrete at 50 kilometers per hour. The Hell's Bridge, built in 1911, designed to carry 50 tons, absorbs an explosion equivalent to 17 tons of TNT. The center span disintegrates. Steel reinforcement beams, each weighing 4 tons, are blown 300 meters downstream. The stone support pillars, standing since 1911, crack and collapse. Cars 6 through 24, still moving at 48 kilometers per hour, arrive at a bridge that no longer exists. They plunge into the Meuse River, 1,200 tons of freight and armor falling 40 meters, hitting water and rock. 3 more Panzer IV tanks enter the river. Their crews, sleeping in tents 50 kilometers away, will arrive tomorrow to find their armor at the bottom of a river. Total losses, unsalvageable. The ammunition continues detonating. Secondary explosions ripple through the wreckage for 3 minutes. The Meuse River, normally 40 meters wide at this point, is temporarily dammed by wreckage. Water backs up, floods the eastern bank, then surges downstream when the debris shifts. Weber's locomotive, separated from the freight by those critical 30 seconds, makes the curve safely. Weber applies full braking, brings the locomotive to a stop 300 meters past where the bridge used to be. He and Schmidt climb down from the cab, walk back toward the explosion site. They stand at the edge of the gorge, staring at wreckage and smoke and water churned brown by debris. "What happened?" Schmidt asks quietly. Weber doesn't answer immediately. He's running calculations, trying to understand. The brakes were tested. The line pressure was correct. Something failed, but he doesn't know what. Behind them, the morning sun rises over the Ardennes. Somewhere 3 kilometers away, Jacques Moreau is eating breakfast, listening to his wife talk about neighbors and ration coupons. In 6 hours, he'll report to work at the rail yard. Someone will tell him about the disaster at Dinant. He'll express appropriate shock and concern. He'll file his routine inspection reports. Nobody will suspect him. Why would they? He's just a railway porter, 53 years old, doing the same job he's done for 30 years. The investigation begins within hours. German military police arrive at the disaster site by 0800 hours. They're followed by railway engineers, military investigators, and by 1100 hours, Gestapo officers who suspect sabotage. The lead investigator, Major Klaus Richter, specializes in transportation security. He's investigated 17 incidents of suspected railway sabotage across occupied Europe. He knows what to look for: explosives planted on tracks, cut brake lines, loosened rail bolts. Richter spends 3 days examining the wreckage. The explosion destroyed most of the physical evidence, but enough remains to reconstruct the sequence. The train entered the curve at unsafe speed. The engineer attempted to brake. Something failed. The question is whether the failure was sabotage or mechanical malfunction. Richter interrogates Weber extensively. Walk me through the braking sequence. When did you first notice speed climbing? Weber explains. Kilometer marker 48. Speed began increasing despite brake application. By kilometer, marker 50, braking was ineffective. Could you have misjudged the grade? Applied brakes too late? I've crossed this route 23 times. I know the grade. I braked at the correct marker. Richter interviews Schmidt, the fireman. His testimony matches Weber's exactly. The brakes were applied correctly. They failed progressively. On April 29th, Richter's team recovers brake components from several derailed cars. The parts are damaged by explosion and river water, but enough remains for analysis. Richter brings in a railway brake specialist, a German engineer named Otto Krause, who designed brake systems for Reichsbahn. Krause examines the recovered components for 6 hours. He identifies components from 8 different cars. 3 show normal wear. 5 show unusual failure patterns. This brake cylinder, Krause points to a water-damaged component, the release valve is installed backwards. The primary piston has components that belong in the release assembly. Richter leans forward. That would cause failure? Absolutely. The brake would appear functional during testing but fail under sustained use. The release valve would overheat, deform, eventually stop functioning entirely. Could this happen accidentally during maintenance? Krause shakes his head firmly. Impossible. These components are mechanically incompatible. You can't accidentally install them incorrectly. The threading doesn't match. You'd have to force them, deliberately swap parts that don't belong together. Sabotage. Unquestionably. Richter immediately orders investigations of all railway maintenance personnel who had access to Transport 451. The list includes 47 Belgian workers at Liège rail yard. All are interrogated. All deny sabotage. All claim they performed standard maintenance procedures. Jacques Moreau is interviewed on May 2nd. The interrogation takes place in a converted warehouse near the rail yard. Richter conducts it personally. You inspected the brake systems on Transport 451. Yes, sir. Standard inspection. I checked line pressure, verified brake engagement. Did you notice anything unusual? Any components that appeared damaged or incorrectly installed? No, sir. Everything appeared normal. Richter studies him. Jacques meets his eyes. 30 years of railway work gives him absolute confidence in technical discussions. He knows brake systems better than Richter ever will. These brake systems are complex. Could someone sabotage them without expert knowledge? No, sir. You'd need to understand the internal components, how they interact. A saboteur without training would likely damage the system in obvious ways. But someone with your experience could sabotage them subtly? Jacques pauses, lets the question hang for 3 seconds. I suppose. But why would I? I've worked for Belgian railways for 30 years. I do my job. I don't involve myself in politics. Richter has no evidence. No witnesses saw Jacques modify anything. The inspection logs show routine maintenance. Other workers confirm Jacques performed standard procedures, same as always. On May 5th, Richter interrogates all 47 maintenance workers simultaneously, separating them into rooms, asking identical questions, looking for inconsistencies. He finds none. The Belgian railway workers have worked together for years. They know how to maintain unified stories without explicit coordination. Richter's report, filed May 12th, concludes that Transport 451 was sabotaged, but the perpetrator cannot be identified. He recommends increased surveillance of railway workers, mandatory German supervision of all brake inspections, and random testing of brake systems after maintenance. The new procedures increased German manpower requirements by 40%. There aren't enough German railway specialists in occupied Belgium. The system slows down. Train departures are delayed. Supply schedules slip. Jacques continues working. He doesn't attempt any more brake sabotage. The new German supervision makes it impossible, but he's achieved his objective. 1 train, 12 tanks, 14 tons of ammunition, and a critical bridge. The replacement bridge won't be completed until September 1944, by which time Allied forces will be advancing through Belgium anyway. The strategic impact of Jacques' sabotage becomes clear only in retrospect. The 12th SS Panzer Division, Hitler Youth Division, receives replacement tanks eventually, but not the tanks at the bottom of the Meuse. When D-Day comes on June 6, 1944, the division counterattacks with 87 tanks instead of 99. 12 tanks fewer because of one sabotaged brake system. In the arithmetic of war, 12 tanks seem insignificant. But on July 8, 1944, during the Battle for Hill 112 in Normandy, the 12th SS Panzer Division attacks British positions with every tank they can field. British forces hold, barely, losing 63 tanks to German fire. Post-battle analysis suggests that 12 additional German tanks, positioned at critical points, might have broken the British line. The British line held. The battle became a stalemate. The German offensive failed. 1 railway porter with a wrench, 1 sabotaged brake system, 1 train at the bottom of the Meuse. The connection between Jacques' modification and the Battle for Hill 112 is invisible, impossible to trace, but the mathematics work. Remove 12 German tanks from an engagement, and outcomes change. Jacques Moreau never knew. He continued working at Liège rail yard through the end of German occupation. When Allied forces liberated Belgium in September 1944, Jacques returned to his routine: inspect brakes, file reports, maintain freight cars. In December 1944, a British intelligence officer visited Liège, investigating suspected sabotage incidents. He interviewed railway workers, trying to understand how resistance networks operated. Jacques was never interviewed. His name never appeared in any reports. The British officer's conclusion stated that organized resistance cells caused the Hell's Bridge disaster, coordinated sabotage by trained operatives. The report never mentioned Jacques Moreau, because Jacques wasn't part of any resistance network. He was a railway porter who knew brake systems and had a dead son-in-law to avenge. After the war, the Belgian government awarded medals to railway workers who participated in resistance activities. Jacques wasn't among them. Nobody knew what he'd done because he'd never told anyone. Not his wife, not his colleagues, nobody. Jacques retired from Belgian railways in 1951 at age 60. He died in 1968 at 77. His obituary in the Liège newspaper mentioned 35 years of service to the railway. It didn't mention that he'd sabotaged brake systems on multiple German military trains, that he'd destroyed a bridge, that he'd sent 12 Panzer tanks to the bottom of a river. The Hell's Bridge was rebuilt in 1947. Modern engineering, reinforced concrete, designed for heavy freight. Trains cross it daily. Most engineers don't know the history, don't know that the previous bridge exploded, don't know about Transport 4451. In 1983, a Belgian military historian researching railway sabotage during the war discovered Richter's investigation report in captured German archives. The report mentioned sabotaged brake systems, mentioned the interrogations, mentioned that the saboteur was never identified. The historian cross-referenced maintenance logs and found Jacques Moreau's name on Transport 4451's inspection report. He found similar patterns on 16 other trains that experienced suspicious brake failures between February and April 1944. The historian published a paper in 1985 titled Invisible Sabotage, Railway Brake Modifications in Occupied Belgium. The paper identified Jacques Moreau as the likely saboteur, but noted that Jacques had died in 1968, taking his secrets with him. Jacques' wife, Marie, was still alive. The historian interviewed her in 1986. She was 91 years old, living in a care facility in Liège. "Did your husband ever mention sabotaging German trains?" Marie smiled. Jacques never talked about his work. He'd come home, eat dinner, go to bed. For 35 years, the same routine. "But did you suspect..." "Suspect what?" "That my husband was a hero? Number. I thought he was a railway porter." "That's what he was," the historian pressed. "After the Hell's Bridge disaster, did Jacques seem different? Anxious? Worried about being caught?" Marie thought for a long moment. "The night after that disaster, Jacques came home at his usual time. I asked if he'd heard about the explosion. He said yes. Terrible accident. Poor engineer. Then he ate dinner and went to bed. That's all. He gave no indication he was involved." "Why would he be involved?" "He inspected brakes. He filed reports. That was his job." The historian thanked Marie and left. He never definitively proved Jacques' involvement. The evidence was circumstantial, suggestive, but not conclusive. In 1994, the Belgian government erected a memorial at the site of the Hell's Bridge, commemorating resistance fighters who sabotaged German supply lines. The memorial lists 37 names. Jacques Moreau's name isn't among them. Modern railway brake systems use computerized monitoring. Sensors detect pressure abnormalities instantly. Centralized control systems can identify failing components before they cause accidents. Sabotage, like Jacques', would be detected immediately. But in 1944, brake systems were mechanical, maintained by hand, dependent on human expertise. A man with 30 years of experience could modify components in ways that visual inspection wouldn't reveal. He could create failures that manifested hours later, kilometers away, with no traceable connection to his modifications. Jacques Moreau understood something fundamental about complex systems. They're only as reliable as their maintenance. Introduce subtle errors at the maintenance level, and the entire system fails in unpredictable ways. The Germans never learned this lesson. They continued relying on Belgian railway workers throughout the occupation. They increased supervision, added inspections, implemented new procedures. But they couldn't replace 30 years of expertise. They needed men like Jacques, needed his knowledge, his experience, his ability to keep trains running. What they couldn't know, was that knowledge is a weapon. Expertise can be weaponized. A man who knows how systems work also knows how to make them fail. Jacques Moreau never received recognition. He never sought it. He did his job, modified brake systems when opportunities arose, and went home to dinner with his wife. That was enough. On June 6, 1944, as Allied forces stormed the beaches of Normandy, 12 Panzer IV tanks sat at the bottom of the Meuse River, rusting, useless, removed from the war by one man with a wrench and perfect knowledge of brake systems. Sometimes the greatest acts of war aren't remembered because they're invisible. No explosions, no gun battles, no dramatic last stands, just quiet modifications made by skilled hands, creating failures that cascade through enemy logistics, removing resources from battles that haven't happened yet. Jacques Moreau saved lives he'd never meet, influenced battles he'd never witness, changed outcomes he'd never know about. He was a railway porter who knew brake systems. That knowledge, applied correctly at the right moment, was worth a division of soldiers. Remember this. When experts tell you something is impossible to sabotage, they mean it's impossible to sabotage, obviously. Subtle sabotage, modifications that create delayed failures, require expertise the enemy depends on.